If there were a world championship for losing your job the fastest, the British Prime Minister would surely be taking home the gold. In just over a decade, we've chewed our way through 7 different Prime Ministers. Even Keir Starmer has had to pack his bags and hand over the keys to number 10. It begs the question, what on earth has happened to Britain? How did a nation once globally regarded as the absolute gold standard of political and economic stability end up changing its leadership as often as the weather? It's incredibly tempting to point the finger at the usual suspects. You could blame Brexit, the energy crisis, or the endless heated debates over immigration, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But if you really want to untangle this right old mess, looking at the politicians of today won't get you very far. To find the actual root of the problem, we need to wind the clocks back 40 years. We need to return to our most glittering and transformative decade, the 1980s. Because the truth is, the incredibly expensive bills this country is being forced to pay today were actually written, signed, and posted back then. Let's take a look at what Britain really lost. Before we talk about why young people today would rather adopt a rescue cat than have a child, we need to talk about where they live.
If you cast your mind back to the 1970s, living in a council estate was perfectly normal. There wasn't any of the stigma you might see today. Millions of working-class families grew up in those red brick terraces or towering concrete blocks. Front doors were often left unlocked, you knew every neighbour by name, and, crucially, the rent was so cheap that keeping a roof over your head rarely kept you awake at night. A house back then was quite simply just a home. But as we rolled into the 1980s, a new kind of atmosphere began to drift down our high streets. It was the sudden, intoxicating aspiration to get rich. It was perfectly captured by Del Boy in our beloved sitcom Only Fools and Horses, with his famous catchphrase, "This time next year we'll be millionaires." That was the mood of the nation. And then the government decided to make that dream a reality. In 1980, Margaret Thatcher introduced the Right to Buy scheme. It allowed council tenants to buy the very homes they were renting, with discounts of up to 50%. It was an absolute explosion of wealth. Over 1.5 million council houses were sold off. Just imagine it, ordinary working-class folks suddenly holding the deeds to a massive financial asset. Front doors were painted, new fences went up, and every morning mortgage leaflets came slipping through the letterbox. This was the exact moment the British public was introduced to a brand new financial drug, spending tomorrow's money today.
But history, as we know, always comes with hidden terms and conditions. The great bitter deception of the Right to Buy scheme was the catch. The government strictly forbade local councils from using the money they made from those sales to build new council houses. The result? Our entire stock of affordable housing practically vanished overnight. When today's millennials and Gen Z finally grew up, the safety net of those cheap, cheerful 1970s council estates was completely gone. They were thrown straight into an utterly ruthless private renting market. A modest terrace house bought for a few £1,000s in 1980 is now worth £500,000. The concept of a house completely shifted. It stopped being a place to raise a family and transformed into an investment vehicle, a commodity to be hoarded and traded. Today, if handing over your rent takes up half your monthly wage, buying a home in London or the South East is little more than science fiction. And realistically, if you can barely afford to keep a roof over your own head, how on earth are you supposed to afford a cot for a baby? But the housing crisis is only half the story. To understand why the British birth rate has plummeted and why the traditional family structure feels like a relic of a bygone era, we have to look at what happened to our communities during that same decade. For generations, Britain was built on the backbone of heavy industry, mining, steelworks, shipbuilding. These weren't just jobs, they were the very glue that held towns together. But during the brutal miners' strike of 1984 and 85, that entire way of life was effectively dismantled. The pits closed, the factories shut their gates, and for the young people left behind, there was only one real option: pack your bags and head south to find work in the booming service sectors.
This mass migration broke something fundamental. The traditional extended family, having your mum and dad just down the road to help look after the kids while you went to work, was shattered. The old model of a village raising a child was completely wiped out. Meanwhile, down in London, the world was changing at a dizzying pace. 1986 brought the Big Bang, the sudden deregulation of the financial markets that turned the City of London into a global powerhouse, and with it came a brand new breed of Brit, the Yuppie. Suddenly, success wasn't about settling down early, it was about brick-sized Motorola mobile phones, leather-bound filofaxes, driving a Porsche 911, and sipping Chardonnay in a trendy wine bar instead of having a pint of bitter at the local pub. Women, inspired by the power-dressing shoulder pads of American soaps like Dynasty, were rightly entering the corporate workforce in their droves, competing fiercely on a level playing field. The ultimate aspiration became the dink lifestyle: dual income, no kids. Having a child transformed from a natural expectation into an incredibly expensive lifestyle choice. And my word, did it get expensive. If you were a latchkey kid in the 70s, your childhood was essentially free. You came home from school, let yourself in, grabbed a biscuit, and played out on the street until the streetlights came on. But following the Education Reform Act of 1988, which introduced school league tables, childhood became an absolute arms race. Today, parents are expected to fund endless maths tutors, piano lessons, and weekend sports clubs just to keep up. It's no wonder so many young professionals look at the sheer cost of raising a child in a modern British city and decide to buy a cockapoo instead. It's vastly cheaper, requires less space, and you never have to worry about whether it's going to pass its GCSEs. But perhaps the cruelest blow of all, the absolute nail in the coffin for the British birth rate, is what we might call the great generational betrayal. Think about a young lad leaving school in the late 70s or early 80s. He might walk straight into the Ford plant in Dagenham or a local steel works. He had what we used to call a job for life. He had a powerful union watching his back, a guaranteed pension, and at 5 o'clock on the dot, he was clocking off and heading down the local pub for a pint. And what if he chose to go to university? Well, the very politicians who shaped the 80s and 90s went to university entirely for free. In fact, the government actually handed them maintenance grants just to cover their living costs. They had a massive cast-iron safety net strung up beneath them. With that kind of unshakable security, having 3 or 4 children wasn't some terrifying financial leap of faith, it was just the normal next step in life. Now look at the grandson of that factory worker today. He is told he absolutely must go to university, and he graduates carrying a staggering £50,000 of student debt strapped to his back. And what is his reward? He enters a modern gig economy, where a job for life sounds like an ancient mythical legend. Instead of a career, he is handed a 0-hour contract. He's cycling through the freezing rain to deliver a takeaway for Deliveroo with no sick pay, no guaranteed hours, and certainly no pension. We have systematically stripped away every single ounce of economic security from an entire generation, handing them a mountain of debt instead. And yet, society still has the audacity to scratch its head and wonder why they aren't settling down to start a family.
So here we have the inevitable knock-on effect, a native population that is rapidly aging and young adults who simply cannot afford to replace them. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most controversial item on our 1980s bill, immigration.
Every politician who stands at the dispatch box promises to bring the immigration numbers down, and every single one of them fails. They fail because you cannot run a modern British economy without them. Take a walk down any typical British high street. Before the 80s, it was dominated by the grumpy local butcher and the baker who rigidly locked their doors at 5 o'clock on the dot. Then came the corner shop, largely run by hard-working South Asian families. They stayed open 24/7. If you needed a pint of milk, a loaf of bread, or to rent a VHS tape at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, they were the ones working the till. They didn't complain, they didn't threaten to strike, they just grafted. This reliance on overseas labour isn't some modern phenomenon that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. It is woven deep into our most cherished institutions. If you go back to the 1960s, even Enoch Powell, the very politician infamous for his fierce anti-immigration rhetoric, was actually over in the Caribbean desperately begging nurses to come and work for the NHS because we simply didn't have the numbers. And when the country completely ground to a halt during the infamous Winter of Discontent in 1978 and 1979, the reality of this reliance became undeniable. It was an apocalyptic time. Rubbish was piled high in Leicester Square. The dead were left unburied because the gravediggers were on strike, and the nation was quite literally freezing in the dark. Yet the lights stayed on in the hospital wards. Why? Because a massive proportion of the nurses keeping the NHS from total collapse were from the Philippines, India, and the Caribbean. They were the ones working through the night.
This is the ultimate paradox that leaves our modern prime ministers tearing their hair out. We want the thriving, high-skills service economy that the 1980s promised us. We want the soaring property values. But to have those things, we sacrificed our affordable housing. We sacrificed the tight-knit communities that made raising a large family possible. And we stopped producing enough young workers to look after our own elderly. History is always perfectly balanced. The chaotic political landscape, the endless debates over borders, and the crippling cost of living aren't just sudden crises. They are simply the delayed invoice for the economic miracle we bought into 40 years ago. We wanted to have our cake and eat it too, and now somebody has to wash the dishes. What do you think about the price Britain has paid for its modern economy? If you had the power to rewind the clock to the 1980s, what would you do differently? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you've enjoyed this trip down memory lane, don't forget to subscribe to the Nostalgia Brit for more stories from our past. See you in the next one.